Well, good morning. It is good to see you here. If you're a guest, we're especially glad you're here. You might have noticed there's a lot of people that look like they're dressed to go to work at Best Buy this morning. But that is our Royal Family Kids Camp is a free week of camp that Christian Chapel provides every year for children in foster care. So for taking about 75 of our volunteers who are going to spend an entire week at camp. We've got another 25. I think there's over 100 volunteers total that are serving in one capacity or another throughout the week. And so this week we're going to take a group of kids out to camp and spend a week just helping them understand that God loves them, that He has a plan for them, and that even if life has been really hard, which many of you I know are aware that the qualifications to be placed in the foster care system are never a good thing, right? It's always because a child has been abused, abandoned, neglected in some form or fashion. And so for now 19 years, Christian Chapel has been providing this camp as a way for us to provide an island of hope for these kids in their year, and also as a way for us to partner with foster parents. You know, those of you, many of you in our congregation have made the commitment to foster kids in your home, and you understand that because of the trauma they've experienced, sometimes that comes out in very difficult behaviors. And so this camp is a way for us not only to minister to kids, but also to be part of providing some relief and some rest for foster moms and dads who've opened up their hearts and their homes to these kids. Last year, we also launched Royal Family Kids Club and Mentoring Program, where we're able to maintain an ongoing connection with some of our campers throughout the school year. And so our camp staff who go, some of them volunteer to be partnered with a child. It's kind of a big brothers, big sisters type format where they are able to spend additional time with them throughout the school year. Once a month, they come to the church for a club meeting, which is kind of a little mini camp experience for them where they play games and hear Bible stories and eat snacks. And it's just really been a tremendously good thing for us. Every year before we go to camp, we use this service to focus on how the gospel impacts the lives of children in very broken circumstances. This past spring, Dr. Barbara Sorrells, one of our attenders, told me about a man named Alton Carter. She said, "You've got to read Alton's book." And so I bought it and read it and immediately sent him an email and said, "Whatever we've got to do, we really want you to come here on July 9th. And so he was kind enough to make that work. You'll see when you go out, there are 3 books back there that Alton has written. The first is called The Boy Who Carried Bricks. It's Alton's story of growing up in foster care in Oklahoma, and just tells his story of overcoming incredible challenges, facing all sorts of difficulty. And the thing, both in talking with him and reading it and talking with other social workers and other people involved in those areas, is Alton's story is a story of so many kids in Oklahoma. It's a story of so many of our campers. And the beautiful part of his story is how God used so many people over the course of his life to bring hope and love to him in moments when he really needed it. He also wrote one called Aging Out, which is kind of the story of what happens when you've grown up in foster care and you turn 18 and suddenly you're on your own. And it's a really, again, incredible story of God using different people at different points to help him navigate a new life. And then his most recent one is called The Boy Who Dreamed Big. It's a children's book that's just geared to encourage children, hey, no matter where you are, you can dream big dreams for your life. God has big plans for you. So Alton had that whole experience. I'm going to let him tell you most of his story. He currently serves as the youth director at First United Methodist in Stillwater, and is a Cowboy fan, I believe, right? You kind of have to be. Is that a requirement of living in town? Yeah. So for the rest of you who are Cowboy fans, you'll have a kindred spirit here this morning. But if you will join me in welcoming Alton, and we're just going to ask the Lord to speak through him to us.
I'm not going to set that on there because I promise I'll crack that, and that wouldn't be good. Thank you all so much for welcoming me into your home. I like to call churches home because that's what it became to me. Even at First United Methodist Church in Stillwater, I was that guy that went to church forever. I mean, when I got older, I started going to church with my wife. Growing up as a kid, we went to church, but it had a different meaning. And so when I'm an adult and all of a sudden they hire me as a youth director, here's the truth. I was faking it with the best of them. So I was the guy that showed up to church and acted like I had it all together. And then I wrote my books, and all of a sudden my first book won like 4 national awards, and I'd walk into the church And everybody in the church was so proud of Alton. Oh my goodness, you're amazing. And you know, every time somebody said, I'm proud of you, it made me feel more and more like a piece of dirt. That I was ashamed of who I was because I was faking it. Here's what I mean. Anybody ever leave your house and you're in the car with your spouse coming to church and you have a knockdown drag out till you get to church? But the minute you step on that church property, you're the happiest couple in the entire world. The most important thing in life is to be sincere. Once you learn how to fake that, you've got it made. That was me. So I showed up to church thinking, man, I don't want anybody to know that I'm insecure. I have no idea. And I had this amazing conversation with my preacher, Mike Chafin. In fact, he spoke those words to me that were so true. I wanted to chop him in the throat. And so here's what he said to me. I said, you know what? I'm tired. Everybody's talking about this book and all these awards, and I'm tired of it. I said, I'm tired of trying to make everybody think I'm perfect. And he said, you're failing miserably. And it kind of bothered me that he said that. I thought, that's not what you're supposed to say. But you know what he did? He freed me. That what happens for me most of my life, even up until the books, is I was walking through the church doors trying to convince everyone else that I had it all together, and I didn't let God heal me. I didn't let God work on Alton because I'm too busy trying to fake it. And so as much as I'm going to share my story about broken kids, I hope that I inspire you to let some things go. By the time I'd finished high school, 17 foster homes, 3 institutions, and a boys ranch because my mother cared more about prescription drugs than she did her 5 children. And we'd get up and try to go to school, and we often didn't have electricity. The DHS worker would come to our house, and you know, the roaches and bugs everywhere, and sometimes she'd find us eating spinach out of a can. We'd go to school, and you can imagine we were a mess, dirty clothes, just in trouble all the time. My mom had 5 kids. All of us had different dads. None of our dads ever cared to stick around. In fact, on all of our birth certificates, it's blank. And so it was rough. And my mom had this idea that she wanted to find men. She thought, if I just find a man that will come in and be a father to these kids, maybe that would change. And for whatever reason, I was kind of this weird, maybe I still am, but this weird guy that I thought about stuff. And I started asking myself these questions when these men would come into my house. I'm like, I don't understand why, Mom, if you want someone that's a good man, why they're moving into our house eating our food. Shouldn't it be the other way around? See, I didn't voice those things. I kept them to myself. And so I'm going to school. I'm getting in trouble. And by the time I was 8, would you believe I'd been to the doctor 7 or 8 times because our house was in such bad shape that I'd go to the doctor to get roaches taken out of our ears. That we were a mess, that we'd get beat. By the time I was 8, I'd been whipped with extension cords, belts, broomsticks, locked outside one night, and mosquitoes had eaten my whole entire body. That my house was full of pain and suffering. And one day, at 8 years old, my siblings and I are walking home from school, and this car pulls up, and it's our DHS worker, and she said, Alton, I want you to get in the car. And so we got in the car, and she took us to the Payne County Youth Shelter in Stillwater, Oklahoma. I remember walking into the youth shelter, and she pointed to this bed, and she said, Alton, here's your bed. Here's where you're going to sleep. I remember looking at that bed thinking to myself, this is the first time in my life that I'll sleep in a bed by myself. At the end of the next day, I remember thinking, this is the first time in my life that I will have eaten 3 meals in one day. So we spent a couple of days in the Payne County Youth Shelter, and she said, you get to go to court, and you're going to see your mom, and you can't talk to her. Now, my mom made a whole bunch of bad choices and in many cases put us last. But I loved my mom unconditionally regardless. And that was hard. I even knew as a kid that she wasn't taking the best care of us. But I still loved my mom. So we go to court and I see my mom standing over on the side, and we sat down behind our caseworker and they're talking, and all of a sudden I hear the judge say this phrase that changed my life. Glendola Vick, that was my mom's name, you're unfit to be a mother and you can no longer have your 5 children. And my mom got drug out of the courtroom, kicking, screaming, crying, and took us out in the hallway. And I remember thinking to myself, here's what I said. Never in a million years will a judge ever say, Alton Carter, you're unfit to be a father. I saw the pain that it brought. I didn't understand. I was angry and frustrated. You know, my siblings, all felt the same way. I knew their hearts were broken. Watching mom get drug out of the courtroom like that, I knew they wanted something different, but they didn't change. My oldest brother just got out of jail, about 13 domestic assault and battery charges. In fact, when I tell my story, I asked him when my book came out, I said, when I get up and speak, what do you want me to say to people about you? He said, tell them the truth, hoping they will learn from my mistakes. My youngest brother is currently locked up in jail for drugs. My sister overdosed and killed herself in 2012, leaving behind 4 children. And then I lost another brother when he was 12. I was the first person in the history of my family to ever graduate from high school. Before me, every member in my family dropped out of school by 9th grade. And people ask me why. In fact, people used to tell me all the time, oh, you're this hero, you had courage, and it's not that, or you're better than your family. And I'll tell you right now, it's not that. I simply chose. I chose to do something different because at every stage in my life, I had people like you there that I rejected in the beginning. So you would have never known that you meant something to me because of the things that my family told me. So we leave the courtroom and the judge says, Alton, you and your siblings can't live with your mom, but you can go to your grandparents. So we go to my grandparents' house. There was my grandmother, my grandfather, my Uncle Billy, my Uncle David, my Uncle Stevie, my 2 cousins, Mario and Martina, and now 5 Carter kids living in a 3-bedroom house. So we'd get up and go to school, and we slept on the floor in the living room. My Uncle Billy was this abusive man. My Uncle Stevie was an alcoholic, and I had another Uncle David who was an alcoholic. My grandmother struggled with depression, and she drank sometimes and kind of was violent and mean to us, but she loved us. My grandmother loved her sons unconditionally. She allowed them to treat us in ways that shouldn't have been allowed. They were mean and hateful to us, and you'll hear a little bit more about that here in a second. My grandfather was this person that had more integrity than anybody I'd ever met, and I never understood why he stayed there. I never understood why he stood around with this dysfunctional family, but he did. He refereed sports in the evenings. He had a 9-to-5 job, and then he let racing pigeons go on the weekend to provide for this family. He never lied. He never cheated. He never stole from anyone. And in fact, when life got crazy, my grandfather would just get in the car and leave. So we're exposed to my uncle. At night, my Uncle Steve, when we moved into the house, he started off by telling us like these ghost stories. So he'd wake us up at night and tell us these ghost stories, and then he'd start cooking us these amazing French fries. Man, we thought that was awesome. It went from that to loading us up in his car and taking us out in Stillwater, and he'd make it look like his car was broke down with 7 kids that were not his. And when people would stop, he'd have us go ask him for money so he could buy us whiskey. He made us crawl in Salvation Army boxes and steal things so he could take them to the pawn shop. And if that wasn't crazy enough, after the night was over, he would bring us in, set us down on the couch, and he was making us drink his whiskey. And now, can you imagine what I was like going to school? I would get up in the morning and go to school, and I'd take every bit of that pain and suffering, and I'd give it to people who didn't deserve it. I was disrespectful. I cussed, I fought, I scratched, I clawed. I make it to about the 4th grade, and the principal decided it was going to be a good idea to put Alton in the strictest teacher's class for whatever reason. And so they put me in her class, and I'm telling you, man, I pushed every button, cussed her out, and one day she snaps. She grabbed me by my wrist, she drugged me out in the hallway, slammed me down in a chair, and said, I can't stand you, Alton, get out of my class. Said that in front of everybody. Before I knew it, another teacher, Miss Thompson, came up and she said, I'll take him. She scooped me up and she took me into her classroom and she set me down by her desk, and this lady treated me like a king. She never made me feel stupid. She never called me names. She loved on me even when I didn't deserve it. I think Miss Thompson ended up teaching me I'm sure she taught me a whole bunch of things. One was my family, we grew up hearing these hateful things about not trusting white people and not trusting police and not trusting teachers. And here's what I understand now, that my family, those people were a direct threat to what was happening at home, that they could expose. And so we were taught that you keep all these people at arm's distance. So one day I'm in class and I get in trouble. Miss Thompson said, Alton, today you're going to miss recess. Now, if you're in 6th or 7th grade, back then that was a huge deal. Missing recess was like unbelievable. And not only did she make me miss recess, but Miss Thompson had the nerve to set me by the window so I could see all the kids outside playing. And I'm madder than a hornet, and she comes in class and she said, Alton, we're going to talk about why you're missing recess. And I said, Miss Thompson, we don't even need to talk about it, I know. She said, Alton, tell me, why are you missing recess? I said, Miss Thompson, you're making me miss recess because I'm black. Miss Thompson gets up and she runs out of the classroom crying, and I'm laughing thinking I showed that hag, she won't mess with me anymore. A couple of days later, I'm playing in the front yard and this car pulls up and Miss Thompson gets out of the car and she said, Alton, I want you to meet somebody. I want you to meet my husband. When she said husband, I took off running because I'm thinking this man isn't going to kill me. I made her cry. So I'm running down the street and I turn around and I stop, and Miss Thompson's husband got out of the car and he was black. He got back in his car. They drove off. She never said another word to me. She never gave me a speech about playing the race card. And years later, when I was writing my book, here's what I learned from that lesson. I was a poor, angry, frustrated black kid who didn't have a father and a drug addict mother, but my choices had nothing to do with the color of my skin. You see, sometimes you say things to people or you teach them these lessons and you think it doesn't go anywhere. And it does. That who knows what would have happened had Miss Thompson not only said, I'll take him, but taught me that lesson. I think Miss Thompson gave me the courage to face one of the biggest obstacles in my life. So I kept telling myself, and I believe because Miss Thompson said, I'll take him, that when my Uncle Stevie made me drink this whiskey, that I was going to stand up and tell him no. So one night he brings us in, he sets us down on the couch, and he starts pouring his whiskey, and I stood up and I said, Stevie, I don't care what you do to me, I'm not drinking that whiskey. And my uncle picked me up above his head, and he went over to my grandma's stairs, and he threw me down the stairs, came down and stomped on me, broke my ribs. I got up and I ran into the bedroom, and I called in my grandma's bedroom, and I picked up the phone and I dialed 911, and the police started that way. So I run outside and I'm standing in the front yard, and I look at the police cars coming with the lights shining. They pull up in the front yard. I tell them what happened, and they go in and arrest my Uncle Stevie. I'm still out in the front yard, and I watch them load him up in the police car, and they drive off, and I'm feeling pretty good about myself. After Stevie's out of sight, I get ready to go back in the house, and my family had gathered on the front porch, and they started telling me what a terrible person I was for getting my Uncle Stevie thrown in jail. I was embarrassed and hurt. And, for years when I told people that story, the first thing would say is, you had courage. Man, that took a lot of courage. And I never saw it that way until about probably 2 years ago. Would you believe my whole entire life I thought that I left because I was a coward and I couldn't take it? That's what I thought, that I wasn't strong enough to put up with that, and so I had to leave. Spent the night in the park, got up the next morning, and I went to child services, and I said, I don't care what you do to me, I'm not going back home. The child services took me, put me in the Payne County Youth Shelter. They put me at Lloyd Raider outside of Sand Springs, which is no longer here. Should not have been there. It was one of those places that when you got in trouble, they put you in a straitjacket, in a TOR room. If you were cussing and screaming, they could give you tranquilizer shots back then to calm you down. And so here I am in Raider, and it was split up into cottages, and each cottage had 20 or 30 kids per house. And what they would do is during visitation, they would gather everybody up in this room, and when your family came to visit, they'd call your name. So they'd say, Kevin, your parents are here for Christmas visitation, and he'd get up and walk forward, and his parents would come from a side door, and they'd go off and visit. So I remember thinking, my family's 45 minutes from Stillwater. I know they're coming. Christmas visitation comes and goes. Nobody in my family showed up. I was the only person in my cottage that did not have a visitor. A couple of days later, I got this package in the mail, and it said, to Alton from Mom. And I ripped that package open as fast as I could, and inside of it was a watch about like this one that didn't cost very much. And I went around and I showed everybody in that cottage this watch my mom gave me. Wasn't long before this kid said, hey, Alton, give me your watch. I said, you're not getting my watch. My mom gave this to me. He said, every day that you don't give me your watch, I'm going to punch you in the face. And this 16-year-old kid hauled off and hit me in the face for about 2 weeks. And then he stopped. He finally quit. When I think about that story now, here's what I know. If I would have given him that watch and he felt bad and gave it back, it wouldn't have been the same, because I said it was important to me. And maybe you're asking yourself right now, okay, what's the point to this story? Here's what it is. I travel all over the United States. All too often, I get to watch people give up far more of themselves for less than a watch. They compromise the things they believe in. They allow people to mistreat them so they can feel accepted. I spent about 6 months at Raider, and then I got sent to the Oklahoma Lions Boys Ranch in Perkins, Oklahoma, and that's where the title of my book came from, The Boy Who Carried Bricks. One of the punishments you had to do at the Boys Ranch when you got in trouble is you would stack 5 bricks on your hands, you would walk 40 yards, set the bricks down, turn around, and go get 5 more, and you would do that for 2 hours. If you got a D in school, you had to run 2 miles 3 days a week until your grades came up. If you got an F in school, you ran 5 days a week. We were made to haul hay in the summertime. I tell everybody that's how I got this amazing tan. We cut wood in the wintertime. Again, hauling hay. If we were out in the hayfield and we got in trouble, our ranch dad would kick us out of the back of the truck and make us bear crawl sometimes 15, 20 acres to the gate. He was a horrible man. He managed the cemetery, so we dug graves and mowed the cemetery. I got called the N-word every day while I was at the Boys Ranch and mistreated and abused and slapped around and made to work like we shouldn't have been. Here's what was crazy about that is my ranch dad was the elevated deacon of a church. And so I struggled with 2 concepts. Number one, I hear people call God Father, but I don't have a dad, so that didn't make sense to me. I listen to people talk about God will protect you and never let anything bad happen to you, and where was he? So I concluded that not only am I with a man that claims to be a Christian, but I'm in a church where everybody knew how that man was treating us and nobody ever did a thing. So I ran from church when I left the Boys Ranch. I ran. Didn't like it, was frustrated, didn't feel like, honestly, that God loved me. I know our preacher preached these sermons, and I think he meant it. But I struggled wanting someone to stand up for us. Spent 3 years at the Boys Ranch, and I had this amazing story happen to me at the Boys Ranch. So in 1983, I hadn't been home to visit my family, and I decided for some crazy reason that I was going to save up every bit of my money from hauling hay and cutting wood and my allowance. And when I went home for Christmas, I was going to buy everybody in my family something for Christmas. So in 1983, I saved up $1,500, and I made this list, and I bought everybody in my family something for Christmas. In fact, I bought a few extra gifts. Ranch van drops me off at my grandparents' house, and I walk in the house, and before I get in the front door, I thought, I'm going to go in and say hi, and I'm going to leave all my presents outside. So I set the bag down, I go inside, and man, my family's excited to see me. I spend a few minutes, and they start passing out presents, and we get situated, and they get to passing them out, and I get up, and I run outside, and I grab my presents, and I come back in, and I start passing them out. My youngest brother loved NFL football, so I got him a book that had all the players' names in it. My other brother loved Hot Wheel cars. I got my grandfather a pair of socks that had a dollar bill stuck in between them. My oldest brother was a neighborhood bike thief, so I got him reflectors for all the bikes he had stolen from people. Everybody in my family got something for me for Christmas, and when I went back to that spot that I was sitting, they all forgot about me. Not one present. Not on purpose, but because I was gone. From 1983 until 2007, I hated Christmas. And people thought, I hear people say this all the time. Well, you had a right to, considering that happened to you. No, I didn't. 2 things happened to me that should have changed my perspective. Number one, 1998, my grandfather, the man I loved more than anything else, we found out he got a brain tumor and he was going to die. And so I go spend a few minutes with my grandfather, and I'm telling him how much I loved him during the last part of his life. And my grandfather's laying in this bed, and I'll never forget, he took his arm. He said, Alton, I want to show you something. He moved his arm over, and he moved a stack of papers and handed me an envelope. And I'm thinking, what in the world is inside this envelope? And I rip it open, reach inside that envelope, and pull out That dollar bill I gave my grandfather when I was 13 years old, he kept it. From 1998 to 1983 to 1998, he kept it. You would have thought that would have changed my perspective. 2007, now I'm the guy that faked it again. So I was physically present in my house with my wife and kids for Christmas, but emotionally I checked out. So I put up the lights, griped about it the whole time. I wrapped presents, bitter, frustrated, and almost really became depressed around Christmas time. One time my cousin came over and I thought, now's the opportunity. I'm going to have my cousin tell my wife about the Christmas that I didn't get a present. Because I told her and she was like, that didn't happen, Alton. You're just being a baby, you know. And so my cousin comes off and said, Martina, will you please tell Kristen about the Christmas that I didn't get a present? And my cousin says, I don't remember. And I thought to myself, oh, of course you don't, because you got a present that year. Of course you don't. You got a present. You got something. That's why you don't remember that. And I'm getting ready to get up and walk out of the house. And my cousin said, Alton, but I remember the Christmas that you bought everybody a present. And it dawned on me that, again, all too often we hold on to things. I watch relationships being broken because sometimes we look at it completely wrong. That I spent my whole life looking at a Christmas that I didn't get a present instead of the Christmas that I bought everybody a present. I spent 3 years at the boys' ranch. I ended up running away from the boys' ranch. Well, they fired our ranch dad for child abuse, and then they hired another ranch dad, so I run away, and I go back to Stillwater. I get to Stillwater, and they say, hey, we found you. A few months later, they say, we found you a foster home in Perkins. So I'm like, hey, let's go back to Perkins, and we get in this car, and we drive up to this house, and I get out of the car, and I walk up to this house, and out walks my ranch dad who had been fired for child abuse. Spent about 6 months there, ran away, went to Boley, Oklahoma, ended up in Cushing, Oklahoma. So here's the weird meeting with my new foster parents. So I walk into the living room with my DHS worker. We sat down, and the couches were set up in the square, and this dog, this little black dog, runs into the living room and sits down in the middle of the floor. And my foster mom looks at the dog and says, hello, and calls the dog the N-word. Now, I'm looking at this dog thinking, I don't know if I should kick it or what's happening. I'm frustrated and mad. I'm looking at my DHS worker going, who in the world puts a black kid in a foster home where they're calling the dog that? I couldn't believe it. So I make it through the meeting, and I get up and I run into the kitchen, and I call my grandfather. I said, Grandpa, you better come get me. I'm about to kill a dog and 2 white people. He said, what's the matter? And I told him, and he doesn't say anything. I said, Grandpa, did you hear what I said? They got the dog that's the N-word. Now, my grandfather gave me the greatest speech at that moment I'd ever heard in my entire life. And so I started thinking about what makes speeches great. What makes speeches great? Why did this speech stand out to me? Sometimes it comes when you need it most. Maybe a great speech comes from you making it a great speech and you applying it to your life. And I thought about sermons. See, I was a guy that I'd listen to these great sermons, and man, as soon as I got out of the church, it was gone. I mean, I listened to it for a while, and I pictured myself kind of going into church with this sandbag, and the sermon gave me these words of grains of sand. But in the bottom of the bag is a hole. And so I'd walk out of the church, and honestly, by the time I got home, my bag was empty again. So for whatever reason, this sand stayed. So I'm telling my grandfather, you better come get me. And my grandfather said, Alton, you have no idea what racism is. I'm thinking, yeah, I was in the only black kid in an all-white town, and I've been mistreated and abused, and I heard this stuff. And he said, I was born in 1913. He said, I played on an all-white baseball team when I was 10. And when I went to eat with the restaurant, I wasn't allowed to go in, and I'd have to sit down in the alley and eat. He said, I'd go into a stadium, and a whole entire stadium was calling me the N-word as a kid playing baseball. And this is hard for me to imagine. My grandfather said, Alton, promise me you will not fight when you hear somebody say that word. And I thought, my whole life I'd fought. And you're asking me to do something different? He said, please do not let the name of a dog stop you from being the first person in the history of your family to graduate from high school. I get to watch kids and people sometimes throw their whole lives away because somebody said something they didn't like. He said, remember, when you hear people say that word, they're not talking to you because you're not one, nor will you ever be. That meant something. And it kept me from ruining what I had. So I ended up graduating from high school in 1988 in Cushing, Oklahoma. Go off to college, stayed in college, checked myself into a dorm till about midterm, and I watched all these kids get all these gifts and presents, and I'm about to self-destruct because I'm not getting that. In fact, my family's calling me saying horrible things and wanting all my food and tennis shoes from football. So I'm going to fix them, and I'll drop out of school. I drop out of college and spend the next 4 years of my life homeless, living in the street. And I woke up one day and thought, I've become everything I said I wouldn't. And I remembered that day in the courtroom when the judge said, Glendola Vick, you're unfit to be a mother and you can no longer have your kids. Got a job at McDonald's, Long John Silver's, ended up working, teaching gymnastics. Ended up going back to school 3 times. Graduated from Oklahoma State University, being the first person in the history of our family to graduate from high school. The struggle in between that is I wanted to be this good dad, and I thought that, again, if I fool everyone else, then maybe I'll believe I'm a good dad. So I read What to Expect While Expecting. I put my wife's prenatal vitamins on the counter and made sure she took them every morning. I laminated all the doctor bills. I asked some of the dumbest questions you've ever seen to the doctor so my wife quit inviting me to the appointments. And I thought every bit of this is going to make me be a good dad. And it didn't. That if people tell me that, maybe I'll believe it. And it wasn't. And so I'll tell people all the time, what's your motivation? Mine has always been the same. My motivation, besides having a relationship with Christ and trying to help change people's lives, my motivation has never changed. Kelton Thomas Carter was born on May 28th. He weighed 8 pounds, 12 ounces, 20 and a half inches long, born at 3:31 p.m. Colin was born on May 8th. He weighed 8 pounds, 4 ounces, 20 and a half inches long, born at 10:31 p.m. I watched my kids be born. I changed their diapers. I took them to school, watched Clifford the Big Red Dog till I lost my mind. Was the PTA president. I coached my kids in sports. And today, my oldest son is the second generation Carter in the history of our family to not only graduate from high school, but is studying biology at Oklahoma State University. That he made it. And that came from my church. I'm telling you, I begin to heal because my church, my family. And so each one of us are called to make a difference. Edward Everett Hale says this, I am only one, but I am one. I cannot do everything, but I can do something. I will not let what I cannot do interfere with what I can do. So it's not about comparing yourself to other people. Your job is to share what gift you have with those who need it most. And sometimes it's right inside this building. We want to disqualify ourselves because we're not young or we're not old or we're not as smart as someone else. We're not fast. And God calls you to share your heart. I'm this guy that I've always wanted this phrase to describe me. And so I took my youth group to see this movie, Box Trolls. And I get the phrase that describes Alton and so many people out there in this world. 60 kids in the movie theater, and I hear this quote that I think you'll agree with. It said, sometimes when a heart is broken, it grows back crooked. That was me. What I needed is what you're giving these kids that you're getting ready to go spend time with. Your job is to love them until they can love themselves. It wasn't till I was 40 years old that I honestly believed that God loved me and I was a child of God. So it's about you stepping in line. And here's the phrase that really struggles and frustrates people. And so I'm going to say it. If you think you can save a single one of these kids, you are sadly mistaken. Your job is not to save them. I know there's a lot of people feel like, oh, I got to go and we got to save these kids. I got to make a difference. Your job is not to save these kids. Your job is to give us seeds of hope so we can save ourselves. My teachers didn't know. My 4th grade teacher, when I wrote the book, cried because she said, Alton, I thought I failed you miserably. I was at a garage sale selling my clothes one time, and a lady showed up, and she was my elementary school cafeteria lady, and she told a story to the whole garage sale about how when I showed up to school late for breakfast, she always had 5 trays for us to eat, and I remembered. And so I want to finish with a story about how it's about us doing our part. It's not about us trying to put the whole thing on our back and carry it. It is literally about us doing our part, understanding that we may never see the benefits or the reward for our actions. One day there's a little boy talking on the CB radio, and he said, "Breaker 19, this is Teddy Bear. Anybody out there got your ears on?" This truck driver heard him talking. He said, "Hey, Teddy Bear, what are you doing?" He said, "I'm talking on the CB radio that my dad left me." He said, "What do you mean your dad left you?" He said, "Well, my dad was a semi-truck driver, and he passed away a few years ago." He said, "In the summertime, my dad took the passenger seat out of the semi-truck and he made these clamps to hold me in my wheelchair. And in the summertime, we would drive all over the country delivering goods." Teddy Bear recounted all the famous people he had met and all the wonderful places he had been. He spent on and on and on talking about how much fun he had with his dad, and he ended his story with, "I'd give anything to ride in a semi-truck again." Well, you know, that truck driver is like many of you. He said, "Hey, you give me a few minutes and I'll be there." Teddy Bear threw down that CB radio and he wheeled himself out on the front porch, and in my mind, he was popping wheelies, excited that some stranger cared enough to give him a ride. Can you imagine the look on his face? That truck driver knew that he was going to make a difference. He knew. He felt good about himself. But when he turned the corner to come to Teddy Bear's house, there were a mile of semi-trucks that were listening on the CB radio. And each one of them took turns taking him out of his wheelchair. They put him in the semi-truck, and they drove around the block until every person had taken their turn. That's what you're supposed to do. It's not about you being first or last. It's about you stepping in line and doing your part so people like me can heal. Over the last 3 years, I've spoken to over 400,000 students. And at every school, there's 150 kids in an assembly that will come down and talk about how broken they are. And our job is to love these people in our church and out of church until they can love themselves. I want to close in prayer. And gracious God, we thank you so much for the opportunity to just be in your presence. Lord, teach us that we have value. Help us claim the gifts that you've given us so we can share them with other people. Lord, give us courage to stand up for those who are weak, neglected, abused. Lord, teach us to honor you and to love you. We ask all this in your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Alton, very much. We appreciate you sharing your story with us. And I hope you all find it as encouraging as I did. Both reading his book, going to lunch with him, and then even again here this morning being reminded that, in our darkest hours, God's grace runs deeper. This week at Royal Family, the Bible story we're sharing with the kids all week is the story of Joseph. And the idea that we're driving into their hearts each day is that God has a plan for you, and he's working that plan. And the bad things that have happened, that's not what he wanted, but they're not going to stop him. This morning, we're going to give all of us an opportunity to participate in Royal Family. It's one of those things that we love to do it, and it costs money to do it. We spend about $50,000 a year providing Royal Family Kids Camp and the club and mentoring program. The ushers are going to prepare to come and give us an opportunity this morning to give. We're taking 74 kids to camp this week, and 74 souls that have been hurt, but that God has hope for. And so your giving this morning helps us to provide this week of camp. It helps us to provide the club and mentoring program. So thank you for giving so generously. Thank you for giving joyfully. As we give, the worship team is going to lead us in a song that they've been introducing to us the past couple weeks called Do It Again. And as they lead us, I want to invite you, even as we sing it, to begin to pray that the story Alton told will become the story of each of our campers. That they will begin to understand God has a different future for them, that we'll get to be part of it. Their school teachers will be part of it. Their foster parents will be part of it. Their social workers, their counselors, their therapists, their doctors, everywhere they go, with every person they interact, that God will continue to reveal his will, and he will do it again in their lives. So the ushers are going to come and give us an opportunity to give and participate in that. Thank you for doing that with us.